The avoidant attachment style has one critical vulnerability that can completely dismantle their defensive strategies: the super empath. While most people struggle against the avoidance walls, trying to break them down through pursuit, pleading, or emotional manipulation, the super empath possesses an almost supernatural ability to see through these defenses without triggering them. This creates a psychological dynamic that the avoidant has never learned to navigate, leaving them completely exposed, despite all their protective mechanisms. The super empath operates from a fundamentally different paradigm than typical partners who encounter avoidant individuals. Where others see rejection and interpret it as disinterest, the super empath recognizes fear disguised as indifference. Where others experience the avoidance emotional withdrawal as abandonment, the super empath understands it as self-protection. This distinction in perception creates an entirely different relational dynamic that bypasses the avoidant's usual defensive triggers. Most people who encounter avoidant behavior respond with their own attachment wounds. They become anxious when the avoidant withdraws, angry when the avoidant seems indifferent, or desperate when the avoidant creates distance. These emotional reactions feed directly into the avoidant's defensive system, confirming their unconscious belief that relationships are dangerous and that emotional distance is necessary for survival. The avoidance walls become stronger with each anxious pursuit or emotional demand placed upon them. The super empath, however, possesses an unusual capacity to remain centered in their own emotional experience, while simultaneously understanding the avoidant's internal world. They don't take the avoidance behavior personally because they can sense the deeper currents of fear and trauma that drive these defensive strategies. This emotional detachment isn't coldness or disinterest. It's profound empathy that recognizes the avoidance behavior as communication about their internal state, rather than commentary on the relationship's value. When an avoidant withdraws emotionally, expecting their partner to pursue them or become anxious, the super empath responds with something completely unexpected, understanding without pressure. They might say something like, "I sense you need some space right now, and that's okay. I'm here when you're ready to connect again." This response short-circuits the avoidant's entire defensive system because it doesn't trigger their fear of engulfment or their need to prove their independence. The super empath's ability to provide space without creating distance becomes their most powerful tool in dismantling avoidant defenses. They understand that the avoidance withdrawal isn't rejection, it's regulation. The avoidant needs to retreat to their emotional safe space to process feelings that feel too overwhelming to handle in real time. Most partners interpret this retreat as punishment or abandonment, but the super empath recognizes it as the avoidance way of maintaining their capacity for connection. This understanding allows the super empath to remain emotionally available without being emotionally demanding. They don't chase when the avoidant withdraws, but they also don't punish the withdrawal by becoming cold or distant themselves. They maintain a steady, warm presence that communicates safety without pressure. This consistency begins to challenge the avoidant's fundamental beliefs about how relationships work. The avoidant expects their withdrawal to create drama, anxiety, or conflict. They expect their partner to demand explanations, reassurance, or immediate reconnection. When none of these expected responses occur, when their defensive strategy fails to produce the familiar dynamic of pursuit and distance, the avoidant experiences cognitive dissonance that begins to weaken their defensive structure. The super empath's emotional intelligence allows them to read the avoidant's micro-expressions, body language, and subtle behavioral shifts that reveal their true emotional state beneath the composed exterior. While others see only the surface presentation of indifference or control, the super empath notices the slight tension around the avoidant's eyes when they're feeling overwhelmed, the almost imperceptible softening when they're grateful for understanding, the tiny moments of vulnerability that flash across their features before being quickly suppressed. This hyper-awareness enables the super empath to respond to the avoidant's actual emotional needs rather than their expressed words or behaviors. When the avoidant says they're fine, but their body language suggests distress, the super empath offers subtle support without calling attention to the discrepancy. When the avoidant claims they don't need help, but their energy suggests exhaustion, the super empath finds ways to provide assistance that doesn't threaten the avoidant's sense of competence or independence. The super empath also possesses an unusual ability to communicate in ways that don't trigger the avoidant's defensive responses. Instead of making statements that sound like demands or expectations, they speak in language that honors the avoidant's autonomy while expressing their own needs. Rather than saying, "You never tell me how you feel," they might say, "I'd love to understand more about your inner world when you feel comfortable sharing." This linguistic sensitivity stems from the super empath's intuitive understanding that avoidant individuals are hypersensitive to any communication that feels like pressure, control, or invasion of their emotional autonomy. The super empath learns to express desire without desperation, to show interest without interrogation, to offer support without imposing solutions. This communication style allows the avoidant to lower their defenses gradually rather than feeling the need to fortify them further. The super empath's approach to conflict represents another area where their understanding proves transformative. Most people approach disagreements with avoidant partners by trying to force resolution, demanding emotional engagement, or becoming frustrated by the avoidant's tendency to shut down or withdraw during difficult conversations. The super empath recognizes that the avoidant's withdrawal during conflict isn't disrespect or disengagement, it's nervous system overload that requires time and space to process. When conflicts arise, the super empath creates space for the avoidant to regulate their emotional state before attempting resolution. They might say something like, "I can see this conversation is feeling overwhelming right now. Let's take some time to think about it and come back to this when we're both feeling more centered." This approach prevents the conflict from escalating into a dynamic where the avoidant feels cornered or attacked, which would only strengthen their defensive responses. The super empath's emotional regulation becomes a stabilizing force that the avoidant has rarely experienced in relationships. Most people's emotions fluctuate in response to the avoidant's behavior, becoming anxious during withdrawal periods, relieved during reconnection phases, frustrated by the inconsistency. The super empath maintains emotional equilibrium regardless of the avoidant's current state, creating a safe harbor that the avoidant begins to rely on unconsciously. This emotional stability doesn't mean the super empath lacks feelings or needs. Rather, they possess the unusual capacity to hold their own emotions without requiring their partner to regulate them. They can feel disappointed by the avoidant's withdrawal without making that disappointment the avoidant's responsibility to fix. They can desire more closeness without making that desire a demand for immediate intimacy. This emotional self-sufficiency creates space for the avoidant to approach connection from choice rather than obligation. The avoidant begins to experience something they've never encountered before, a relationship where their defensive strategies don't work, but also aren't needed. The super empath's consistent emotional availability means the avoidant doesn't need to withdraw to maintain their sense of safety. The super empath's respect for boundaries means the avoidant doesn't need to create artificial distance to maintain their autonomy. The super empath's emotional regulation means the avoidant doesn't need to manage their partner's feelings in addition to their own. This experience of unnecessary defenses creates profound confusion for the avoidant. Their entire relational strategy is built around managing perceived threats that simply don't materialize with a super empath partner. They find themselves preparing for conflicts that never come, expecting pressure that never appears, bracing for emotional demands that never get made. The absence of familiar relational dynamics leaves them uncertain about how to behave or what to expect. The super empath's approach begins to activate the avoidance attachment system in ways that feel safe rather than threatening. Because the super empath doesn't pursue when the avoidant withdraws, the avoidant begins to miss the connection and initiate contact themselves. Because the super empath doesn't demand emotional expression, the avoidant begins to share feelings voluntarily. Because the super empath doesn't try to fix or change them, the avoidant begins to relax their vigilant self-protection. This gradual activation of the avoidance attachment needs happens so slowly and naturally that the avoidant doesn't recognize it as a threat to their independence. They begin to look forward to interactions with the super empath because these interactions consistently feel good rather than draining or overwhelming. They start to associate the relationship with relief and comfort rather than pressure and expectation. The super empath's ability to appreciate the avoidant's unique way of expressing love becomes crucial in this dynamic. While most people expect love to be expressed through words, physical affection, or emotional vulnerability, the super empath recognizes that avoidant individuals often express love through actions, practical support, or subtle gestures of care. They notice when the avoidant remembers important details, anticipates their needs, or shows up consistently even when they're not emotionally expressive. This recognition and appreciation of the avoidant's love language creates a positive feedback loop that encourages more expressions of care. The avoidant feels seen and valued for who they are rather than criticized for who they're not. This validation reduces their defensive need to prove their independence or worthiness through emotional withholding. The super empath's ability to see and appreciate the avoidant's hidden depths becomes another crucial factor in dismantling their defenses. Most people relate to the avoidant's surface presentation, their competence, independence, and emotional control. The super empath recognizes and responds to the sensitive, caring, vulnerable person beneath the defensive exterior. They might comment on the avoidant's subtle expressions of care, acknowledge their hidden emotions, or appreciate qualities that the avoidant doesn't even recognize in themselves. This deeper recognition creates a profound sense of being truly seen that the avoidant has rarely experienced. Most people love the avoidant's strong, independent image, which reinforces their defensive identity. The super empath loves the avoidant's authentic self, including their vulnerabilities and fears, which challenges the avoidant to question whether their defensive strategies are actually necessary or helpful. The super empath's intuitive understanding of timing becomes another powerful tool in their approach. They sense when the avoidant is ready for deeper connection and when they need more space. They know when to offer support and when to step back. They understand that pushing for intimacy at the wrong moment will trigger withdrawal, while offering it at the right moment will be welcomed and appreciated. This attunement to the avoidant's emotional rhythms creates a sense of being deeply understood that the avoidant has never experienced before. They begin to trust that the super empath will respect their needs and boundaries, which paradoxically makes them more willing to lower those boundaries voluntarily. The super empath's patience becomes a transformative force in the relationship. They understand that avoidant healing and growth happen on geological rather than human timescales. They don't expect rapid change or dramatic breakthrough moments. Instead, they appreciate small shifts and incremental progress, celebrating tiny moments of vulnerability or connection without making them into bigger deals than the avoidant is ready to handle. This patience isn't passive waiting or martyrdom. The super empath maintains their own life, interests, and goals while allowing the relationship to develop at a pace that feels safe for the avoidant. They understand that pushing for faster progress would actually slow down the process by triggering the avoidant's defensive responses. Their patience creates the psychological safety necessary for the avoidant to risk deeper connection. The avoidant begins to experience trust in ways they never thought possible. Not the surface level trust of knowing their partner won't betray or abandon them, but the deeper trust that their partner truly understands and accepts their emotional limitations. They begin to believe that they can be imperfect, scared, or vulnerable without losing the relationship. This trust becomes the foundation for genuine intimacy. As the avoidance defenses begin to relax, they start to access parts of themselves that have been locked away for years or decades. They rediscover their capacity for affection, their desire for closeness, their need for emotional support. These rediscovered aspects of themselves don't feel threatening because they're emerging in a relationship context that consistently proves safe and accepting. The super empath's influence begins to extend beyond the romantic relationship into the avoidant's broader life experience. As the avoidant learns to trust one person deeply, they begin to develop greater emotional availability in other relationships as well. They start to recognize that their defensive strategies, while protective, have also been limiting their capacity for meaningful connection across all areas of their life. The transformation isn't immediate or dramatic. The avoidant doesn't suddenly become secure or emotionally expressive overnight. Instead, they gradually develop greater tolerance for vulnerability, increased capacity for intimacy, and reduced need for defensive strategies. They begin to choose connection over protection more frequently, though they still maintain their need for independence and emotional space. The super empath's approach works because it addresses the avoidant's core wound without triggering their defensive responses. Most therapeutic approaches and relationship advice focus on breaking down the avoidance walls through direct confrontation or emotional demands. The super empath intuitively understands that the walls will dissolve naturally when they're no longer needed for psychological safety. This dynamic creates a unique form of healing that happens within the context of the relationship, rather than requiring individual therapy or conscious growth work. The avoidant heals simply by experiencing consistent safety, understanding, and acceptance over time. Their nervous system gradually learns that intimate relationships can be safe, that emotional expression can be welcomed rather than punished, that vulnerability can strengthen rather than weaken connections. The relationship between an avoidant and a super empath often becomes a model for what healthy attachment can look like. The super empath's emotional regulation teaches the avoidant that feelings can be experienced without becoming overwhelming. The super empath's respect for boundaries shows the avoidant that closeness doesn't require loss of autonomy. The super empath's patience demonstrates that love doesn't demand immediate or perfect reciprocation. However, this dynamic also requires the super empath to maintain their own emotional health and avoid the trap of becoming an emotional caretaker or savior. The most effective super empaths understand that their role isn't to heal the avoidant, but to create conditions where the avoidant can heal themselves. They maintain their own needs and boundaries while providing the consistent safety that allows the avoidant to gradually lower their defenses. The super empath must also navigate the challenge of not becoming codependent or losing themselves in the process of understanding and accommodating the avoidant's needs. They need to maintain their own emotional center while providing the stability that the avoidant requires for growth. This balance requires significant emotional maturity and self-awareness. The avoidant's encounter with the super empath often represents a turning point in their relational patterns. For the first time, they experience a relationship where their defensive strategies are neither necessary nor effective. This experience plants seeds of possibility that can transform their approach to all future relationships, even if the specific relationship with the super empath doesn't last forever. Understanding this dynamic provides hope for both avoidant individuals and their partners. It reveals that avoidant attachment patterns aren't fixed or unchangeable, but rather adaptive strategies that can evolve when they're no longer needed for psychological survival. The super empath's approach offers a roadmap for creating the kind of relational environment where healing and growth become possible. The key insight is that the avoidant's biggest weakness isn't their fear of intimacy or their defensive strategies. It's their deep, hidden hunger for the exact kind of understanding and acceptance that the super empath naturally provides. When this hunger is fed consistently and safely, the avoidant's entire relational world begins to transform, creating possibilities for connection that they never believed were possible.